President Donald Trump is now in control of the local police department in Washington, D.C., and 800 National Guard troops are on the way as the president takes the unprecedented step of taking over local control there. Now, in his announcement, President Trump cited the murder of a congressional intern this summer. But meanwhile, police in that case say the 21-year-old college student was an innocent bystander. Overall, police statistics show crime is at a 30-year low in D.C. The mayor saying this intervention from the federal government is not necessary. There are a lot of legal questions to unpack here. So joining us now is Neama Rahmani, president of the West Coast Trial Lawyers. Neama, thank you so much for your time today.
Of course, Kate. Thanks for having me, as always.
So the situation in Washington, D.C., of course, is drawing parallels to Trump's takeover of the National Guard in California. But these are very separate legal issues at play. So let's start with D.C. What gives the president authority there to take over the police department?
Kate, under Article 1 of the Constitution, Washington, D.C. is under congressional authority. So President Trump is going to have a lot more leeway there. There's no 10th Amendment that's going to prevent him from stepping in and taking over. So to the extent that the federal government wants to take control of Washington, D.C. police and take over, whether it's the National Guard or just take over entirely, that's within the discretion of Congress, because under the Constitution, they have authority over the district.
Yeah, we just put up right there the Truth Social post from President Trump explaining, in his view, why the takeover is necessary. But meanwhile, D.C.'s Attorney General says they plan to challenge this in court. The president says he's invoking a section of D.C.'s Home Rule Act. So how do you see the legal situation playing out? Does the Attorney General in D.C., does he have a point here?
He has a point, and when you're talking about crime rates dropping, but courts generally, especially judges, are hesitant to step in and stop what they believe may be legitimate law enforcement functions. We're talking about who has authority here. And under the Constitution, it's pretty well established that it's Congress that has authority over D.C. Now, of course, they can cede that authority to local officials there, but that doesn't mean that they can take it back. And we know that Republicans control both houses of Congress and the Oval Office. So I don't think the Washington, D.C. Attorney General is going to be successful in this attempt to stop Donald Trump from taking over law enforcement activities there in Washington, D.C.
Now, in the meantime, we are tracking this 3-day bench trial over the Trump administration's deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles against Governor Newsom's wishes. And we heard from Major General Scott Sherman. He took the stand yesterday. He was at one point the commanding officer of the deployment here. He testified that the troops were here to assist law enforcement, but that he never heard them describe the protests here as an outright rebellion. Can you kind of detail this case? What is the judge looking for?
The Judge Breyer in this case is looking to see whether Donald Trump and the administration violated federal law, and they could have done it in a few ways. One would be to use active duty military for civilian law enforcement purposes. That's generally prohibited by federal law. The second question is, was there a legitimate reason to federalize the National Guard? Now, typically this does not happen over the governor's objection. Now, there are some famous examples in the South during desegregation, but it really hasn't happened recently. And we know that this is not something that Governor Newsom asked for. So the question is this: was there rebellion against the authority of the United States? Was this necessary to affect federal law? And we know that the judge here had actually issued a restraining order stopping the Trump administration from doing this. Now, that order went up on appeal to the Ninth Circuit and it was overturned. So we're really talking about a question of law, and I think the state of California does have a pretty good audience here. Judge Breyer, of course, being the younger brother of former Supreme Court Justice Breyer.
It's been interesting listening to the testimony in this case. Cameras aren't allowed in the courtroom and we're not allowed to broadcast any of it. But we did learn more about that operation in MacArthur Park, where federal agents on horseback briefly took over the park. Viewers might remember Mayor Bash showed up and actually called the Department of Homeland Security, urging them to leave. General Sherman this week testified that he pushed back on that as well and withheld military support. But he also said in other cases he saw the need to back up ICE agents. How much do these details matter in this case?
It does matter, and that was one of the issues that we dealt with on appeal. And there was a three-judge panel, two of which were Trump appointees, one of which was a Biden appointee. But they unanimously agreed that really it's not for the courts to decide what is necessary from a law enforcement perspective. Do you need the National Guard? Do you need the military to protect DHS agents who are enforcing federal law? And I'm not saying that I'm a fan of the ICE raids, but if you just look at federal law, they have the authority to conduct these raids. Now, some of what has been happening has been unconstitutional, and that's a separate judge, Judge Frippong, who issued a restraining order saying that race and being at a Home Depot or at a swap meet, that can't be used, and detainees must be given access to a lawyer. There's some Fourth and Fifth Amendment violations there. But just taking one step back, DHS does have the authority to conduct these raids, and the judges that heard this on appeal said, who are we sitting in a courtroom to decide what is necessary to keep these agents safe? So there is some strong deference here when it comes to the strategy and the tactics that are used by the executive branch.
Right. And there's so many court cases and rulings for us to keep track of amid this administration that is really drastically changing a lot of the parts of the federal government. Neama Rahmani, president of the West Coast Trial Lawyers, thank you again for your time today. We'll check back in with you.
Of course, Kate. Talk to you soon.